When Karen turned my porch into her personal yoga studio, I unleashed a sprinkler-soaked, fence-locked revenge that turned her neighborhood rain into a humiliating spectacle. Watch how one epic showdown reclaimed my peace and exposed her for good. I was halfway through my morning coffee when the sound of chanting and deep breathing floated into my kitchen window, and I froze, mug in hand, wondering which lunatic cult had set up camp on my property this time, only to look outside and nearly choke as I saw Karen clad in neon pink leggings that could blind a hawk, leading a full-blown yoga class on my porch as if she owned the place, complete with 10 strangers laying their mats across my steps. My welcome mat buried under someone's bare feet and a Bluetooth speaker blaring whale sounds like I was running a spa retreat I never signed up for. My jaw dropped, my coffee sloshed over the rim, and for a good 10 seconds I just stood there watching my own front porch transformed into a sweaty Zen paradise without my consent, while Karen, queen of audacity, waved her arms like a self-appointed guru and announced loudly, "Feel the positive vibes of this shared community space," as if my private property had suddenly become a public park. That was the moment I knew something in my brain was about to snap. But instead of storming out, screaming, I decided this insanity needed careful handling or the neighborhood would think I was the crazy one, not the lunatic hosting hot yoga on my doorstep. So I swallowed my rage, set my mug down, and stepped outside, all smiles, already plotting the kind of retaliation that would make the evening news if I played it right. I cleared my throat, ready to confront her like any rational human would, except the second Karen saw me. She raised a perfectly manicured hand, silencing my attempt at reason like I was a child interrupting her holy sermon. "Namaste, neighbor," she said with a smug grin. "I hope you don't mind, but your porch has the best morning sun for my clients. We'll only be here for an hour." The nerve of this woman standing on my doormat on my property, telling me she hoped I didn't mind while ignoring the fact that a complete stranger was sweating on my welcome sign would have been funny if it wasn't happening to me. I managed to keep my voice level, though it shook with barely restrained fury, and replied that yes, in fact, I did mind. This was my home, my porch, and they had exactly 5 minutes to clear out before I called someone to make them leave. Karen's smile didn't falter. In fact, it grew like a cat cornering a mouse. She turned to her class and announced dramatically that we had a disturbance in the energy field and they should all focus on their inner calm while I dealt with a negative force. I was apparently the negative force, now standing barefoot in my own doorway in my own house while 10 people sat cross-legged pretending I didn't exist. I decided polite conversation wasn't going to cut it. So I marched down the steps and planted myself between Karen and her group, blocking her view of the sun she claimed was vital to her spiritual practice, and told her flat out she needed to leave now or I'd make her regret ever stepping foot on my porch. That's when Karen played her trump card. She claimed this was common property, that the HOA encouraged community wellness, and that I, as a good neighbor, was legally obligated to share the space. My porch, which I had paid for, maintained, and cleaned with my own hands, was apparently up for public use because Karen had decided it was so. My laugh came out louder than I expected, echoing across the street and drawing a few curious stares from passing dog walkers, because this was beyond absurd. It was like being in a bad sitcom where logic didn't apply. Karen's face tightened, sensing she was losing control of the narrative. But instead of backing off, she upped the ante by telling her class loudly that some people just hate seeing others happy, turning them against me like I was the villain in this circus. I looked at the garden hose coiled by the steps, glanced back at Karen's ridiculous Zen kingdom sprawled across my porch, and a wickedly brilliant idea lit up my mind. I didn't say another word, just strolled over casually, turned the knob, and within seconds, a perfect arc of cold water sprayed across the porch, soaking mats, leggings, whale sounds, and a very stunned Karen, whose expression twisted from smug serenity to outraged disbelief as she shrieked and tried to shield her hair from the sudden downpour. The class scattered like startled pigeons, slipping on the wet boards, yelling about their phones, their mats, their enlightenment. Karen screeched my name like I had just committed a felony. But the pure joy I felt watching my stolen porch return to me under a curtain of icy justice was worth every decibel of her fury. I shut off the water, looked her dead in the eye, and calmly said, "Class dismissed," before heading back inside to finish my now lukewarm coffee. But Karen wasn't done. By the time I looked outside again, dripping wet and glaring like a villain plotting her next move, she had regrouped with the remaining yoga disciples and started yelling about how I would regret this. My phone buzzed minutes later with a message from a neighbor saying Karen was already spreading rumors that I'd assaulted her students. I realized this wasn't just a one-off trespass. This was the opening battle in what would soon become an all-out neighborhood war. She had crossed the line, and if she thought a little water was the end of my retaliation, she had no idea what kind of storm she just invited into her life. At that moment, watching her stomp down my driveway like a wet, furious flamingo, I knew two things. 1. This wasn't over. And 2. By the time I was done, Karen would never set foot on my porch again, unless she wanted to risk public humiliation, legal trouble, and a revenge scheme so clever it would make her wish she had never unrolled a yoga mat in my presence. This was the day the porch war began, and I had every intention of winning it. The morning after the yoga invasion felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet, like the calm before a storm that everyone knows is coming, but no one dares to talk about. I stood on my porch, the one I had reclaimed with water-powered justice just hours before, and surveyed the damp aftermath. My welcome mat still bore the faint outline of a yoga mat pressed into it, and my steps smelled faintly of lavender oil and desperation. I could feel the tension in the air, invisible but heavy, like every neighbor on the street was holding their breath, waiting to see what Karen would do next. I had dealt the first real blow in this absurd little war. But knowing Karen, queen of audacity and self-declared ruler of all things Hoa, she wasn't going to take the loss lying down. Sure enough, by mid-morning I had my first sign of retaliation. A neatly folded letter slipped under my door, written on pastel stationery with cursive so aggressive it felt like every loop of every letter was screaming at me. It was from Karen, of course, and it declared in no uncertain terms that I had violated community spirit guidelines, committed aggressive and dangerous behavior toward peaceful citizens, and that if I didn't reconsider my hostility, she would have no choice but to escalate matters legally. I read the whole thing twice, laughed harder the second time, then crumpled it into a ball, and slam-dunked it into the trash because I wasn't about to let a woman who believed my porch was a public yoga center intimidate me with glittery stationery threat. By noon, I had my second encounter with Karen, this time face to face. And if I had thought the letter was ridiculous, seeing her marching across my driveway with sunglasses perched on her head like a battle helmet and a stack of HOA printouts in her hand was a whole new level of absurd. She didn't even greet me, just launched straight into a speech about how the shared wellness initiative was essential to neighborhood harmony. How I had no legal standing to deny her access to my porch during designated wellness hours, and how she had already spoken to authorities about my so-called water attack. I interrupted to remind her loudly enough for the neighbor watering his plants to hear that there were no such wellness hours, that this porch was mine, paid for with my hard-earned money, and that she and her yoga disciples were never welcome here again. She smirked like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum, then waved her stack of papers in my face, insisting this was bigger than me, that I was selfish and combative, and that the community supported her efforts to bring peaceful gatherings to underutilized spaces. My porch, my sanctuary, my place to drink coffee and watch the sunrise, had been reduced to an underutilized space. In Karen's twisted logic, I had to dig my nails into my palms to stop myself from screaming right there in the driveway because it was becoming painfully clear. Karen didn't just believe she was entitled to my property. She genuinely thought she was some kind of hero reclaiming it for the greater good. I decided that arguing wasn't getting me anywhere. So, I changed tactic. I told her fine. If she wanted to claim my porch was public property, then I was going to claim her driveway as my personal parking spot and I'd see how she liked it when I set up a lemonade stand in her front yard. The smirk faltered for a second, just long enough for me to know I'd hit a nerve. But then she recovered, tossing her hair and saying, "Do what you want, but the community will always side with me." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just Karen versus me. This was Karen versus sanity itself. And if I wanted to win, I couldn't just match her madness. I had to outsmart it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, sketching out every possible move she could make and every counter I could throw back at her. I knew her type, the kind of person who thrived on control, on twisting the rules, on convincing others that wrong was right if it suited her. If I let her spin the narrative that I was the villain, she'd bury me under fake community complaints before I could blink. No, this needed strategy, precision, and a plan that would not only shut her down, but make her think twice before ever pulling another stunt like this again. The next day, I noticed Karen had rallied a few loyal followers. People too scared or too gullible to say no to her. And they started hanging around my property line, murmuring about neighborhood wellness, shooting me dirty looks like I was the neighborhood Grinch. I caught one of them slipping a flyer under my mailbox promoting porch yoga with Karen. Every morning 8 a.m. All are welcome. That was the last straw. I grabbed my phone, took pictures of every flyer, every person lingering near my fence, every time Karen strutted past my house, making loud, passive-aggressive comments about selfish homeowners. I started compiling evidence because I knew there'd come a time when I'd need to show the real story, not the fantasy world she was spinning. And as I watched her little army grow, I started noticing cracks in her act. She wasn't as universally adored as she pretended. A few neighbors rolled their eyes when she went on her rants. Some even whispered apologies to me when she wasn't looking. I realized then that my biggest weapon wasn't just retaliation. It was exposure. Karen could only rule the neighborhood as long as people bought her saintly act. And I had a feeling it wouldn't survive real scrutiny. But Karen wasn't content with harassment alone. On the third morning after the sprinkler incident, I woke up to find a fresh line of chalk arrows leading from the sidewalk straight up my driveway to my porch as if directing traffic for her next class. It felt like a declaration of war, a colorful dusty middle finger drawn right across my property. That's when the idea for the fence started forming in my mind. Not just a gate, not just a lock, but a structure so undeniable that Karen couldn't twist the rules or gaslight the neighbors into believing she had any right to my land. If she thought she could invade my space and claim it as her own, then I'd make my boundaries so literal and so unbreakable that even her delusional logic couldn't cross them. I spent that entire afternoon online looking up quick install fencing options, heavy-duty padlocks, even motion sensors that could spray water the moment someone set foot on my porch. It wasn't just about keeping Karen out anymore. It was about sending a message to her and every would-be trespasser that my property was not a playground for entitled tyrants in yoga pants. That evening, as the sun dipped low, and I watched Karen across the street, whispering with her minions, casting glances at my house, I felt a strange mix of anger and determination solidify inside me. This wasn't a simple neighborhood dispute anymore. This was a battle of wills, a test of how far one person would go to protect what was theirs against someone who believed no boundary applied to her. She thought she could bully me into surrendering my porch, but she didn't know me. I wasn't the type to roll over and let someone rewrite reality at my expense. I was going to fight back smarter, harder, and louder than she ever imagined possible. And when I was done, Karen wouldn't just lose this fight. She'd regret ever starting it. This war had only just begun, and I was already planning my next strike. 3 days after Karen's porch yoga debacle and her ridiculous attempts to claim my property as community space, I woke to the sound of raised voices outside my window and knew before I even looked that she was at it again. Pulling back the blinds confirmed my suspicion. There she stood right in front of my house, phone pressed dramatically to her ear as she pointed toward my porch, gesturing wildly like she was giving a witness statement in a high-profile crime case. 2 patrol cars idled at the curb, lights off, but engines running, and 2 uniformed officers stood beside her, their expressions hovering somewhere between mild annoyance and confusion as Karen waved her arms and stomped her feet, clearly trying to sell them a story that would make me out to be public enemy number 1. I stepped outside, refusing to let her control the narrative, even for a second. And sure enough, she launched into a speech the moment she saw me shouting about aggressive harassment, dangerous water attacks, and my threatening behavior toward peaceful citizens practicing wellness on shared property. The officers turned to me, eyebrows raised, and asked for my side of the story. I gave it to them calmly, explaining that Karen and her group had trespassed on my privately owned porch multiple times, that I had repeatedly asked them to leave, that when they refused, I turned on my sprinklers to reclaim my own space, and that I had photos, videos, and even HOA bylaws to prove I was well within my rights. Karen interrupted constantly, trying to shout me down, insisting I was lying, that I was a menace to the neighborhood. But the more she screamed, the more skeptical the officers looked. Finally, one of them sighed, looked at her flatly, and said, "Ma'am, this is private property. If you keep trespassing, you're the one we'll be ticketing." Watching Karen's face crumble into a mix of shock, rage, and humiliation was a rare and glorious moment. But it lasted only a second before she switched tactics, clutching her pearls like a silent film actress and whispering that she feared for her safety because I had violent tendencies. The officer just stared at her for a long moment before suggesting she go home and stop causing trouble. When the police cars finally drove away, leaving Karen sputtering on the sidewalk, she spun on me with a look that could peel paint off walls. "You think you've won?" she hissed, voice low and shaking with fury. "But this is far from over." Then she stormed off, heels clicking like gunshots, and I knew she meant it. Later that day, a new problem emerged when a strange car pulled into my driveway and a woman in a professional suit stepped out holding a clipboard. Assuming she was lost, I walked outside to offer directions. But before I could say anything, she beamed at me and asked if she could take a quick look inside because her client was very interested in the property. My brain scrambled to make sense of her words until she added cheerfully, "Karen mentioned this house was hitting the market soon, such a prime location." I nearly choked on my own breath as I told her slowly and firmly that my house was not for sale, had never been for sale, and that Karen had absolutely no right to say otherwise. The realtor looked embarrassed, apologized profusely, and left, but not before telling me Karen had contacted 3 other agents earlier that week, claiming my home was about to list and open for private viewings. The audacity of this woman was reaching new heights. I hadn't thought possible. It wasn't enough that she invaded my space, harassed me publicly, and called the cops on me for defending my own home. Now she was actively trying to sell my house out from under me just to prove a point or make my life miserable. I spent the rest of that day furious, pacing my kitchen, every new thought feeding my determination to put an end to this madness. Karen wanted war. Fine. I wasn't going to let her win this one-sided battle by playing dirty while I stayed polite. That evening, I started recording every single thing that happened outside my home. My porch camera was already active, but now I had my phone ready whenever I stepped outside. Every time Karen walked past making passive-aggressive comments about how some people don't know how to share, I filmed her. When one of her friends came to hang another porch yoga flyer on my mailbox, I filmed that, too, narrating the date and time. I wasn't just collecting evidence for myself anymore. I was preparing for the day when Karen's entire act would crumble in front of the neighborhood and the law if necessary. But even as I planned my counterattack, Karen's antics escalated. She started holding her yoga classes on the sidewalk directly in front of my house, blocking my driveway with her students' parked cars, chanting loud enough to wake the dead, daring me to lose my temper so she could claim I was harassing her again. When I complained about the noise, she told me smugly that sidewalks were public property and she had every right to use the space as she saw fit. The following morning, I found chalk arrows and phrases like "wellness for all" scrolled across my driveway again. Messages meant to taunt me, to make me feel like I was the villain for wanting privacy on my own land. Each new stunt made my blood boil hotter, but it also steeled my resolve. The more she pushed, the more I wanted to hit her where it hurt the most, her ego. Karen wasn't just a petty nuisance. She thrived on control, on convincing others she was the hero of the story, the saintly neighbor spreading light and love while painting me as a monster. I realized the only way to win wasn't just to push back physically, but to dismantle her carefully built facade until everyone saw her for what she really was, a manipulative tyrant in pastel activewear. I started talking to neighbors quietly, gathering small comments, offhand remarks, anything that revealed the truth. It turned out Karen had been pulling stunts like this for years, declaring parts of other people's property community zones, starting rumors about anyone who disagreed with her, even trying to have one family find 4 illegal garden furniture just because she didn't like their lawn chairs. People were tired of her, but most were too intimidated to stand up to her constant harassment. I wasn't intimidated anymore. Not after what she'd done to me. I started piecing together a plan that would not only secure my property permanently, but also expose Karen publicly, leaving her no room to twist the truth. Part of that plan involved building the fence I'd been envisioning, a physical barrier that would stop her trespassing dead in its track. But part of it also involved timing, strategy, and just enough flair to make sure when the tables turned, they turned so hard Karen wouldn't dare come near my porch again. That night, as I sat on my reclaimed porch sipping coffee under the glow of my porch light, I thought about the absurdity of it all. A week ago, my biggest worry had been a late electricity bill and a squeaky screen door hinge. Now, I was in a full-scale Cold War with a woman determined to claim my home as a public yoga retreat and apparently sell it to strangers while she was at it. But despite the chaos, despite the frustration, a dark sort of humor bubbled beneath my anger. Because one thing had become crystal clear. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. She thought I was just another neighbor. I knew that if I wanted to end this ridiculous battle once and for all, I couldn't just keep reacting to Karen's schemes. I needed to go on the offensive and hit her with something so clever and undeniable that even her twisted logic couldn't wriggle free. The seed of the plan had already been planted days ago. The image of her standing there screaming about shared property while soaked from head to toe burned into my mind, and the idea of fencing her car in on my land had grown more tempting with every new stunt she pulled. If she wanted to treat my property like a free-for-all and flaunt her entitlement without consequences, then maybe it was time for her to experience what it felt like to have someone treat her personal space as if it were public property, too. Only this time with no easy escape. So, one evening, I sat down with a notepad, coffee, and a grim little smile on my face, sketching out the blueprints for what I came to call Operation Fencelock. It wasn't going to be petty or impulsive, like turning on sprinklers. This would be precise, perfectly timed, and devastating enough that Karen wouldn't recover from the embarrassment for months. The first part of the plan involved surveillance because Karen's schedule was as erratic as her sense of boundaries, and I needed to know exactly when she'd park her car near my property. I started paying close attention to her routines, noting when she held her so-called wellness sessions, when she stomped past my porch to glare at me, when she called her minions to strategize their next move. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. Every other afternoon, she parked her car half on the curb and half blocking the edge of my driveway while she went off to harass someone else or gossip with her yoga disciples on the sidewalk. That was my opening. If she wanted to treat my property line like her personal parking lot, I would make sure her car stayed exactly where she left it for a very long time. I reached out to a local handyman I trusted, someone who'd done odd jobs for me before, and casually asked how fast one could put up a temporary but sturdy section of fencing around a car without damaging it. His laugh turned into disbelief when I explained the full story. But once he saw I wasn't joking, he grinned and said, with the right materials, less than an hour. That was all I needed to hear. Over the next 2 days, I gathered supplies. Fence panels that could be installed quickly but looked permanent enough to send a message. Heavy-duty padlocks, chains, a few warning signs about private property, no trespassing that I planned to nail right onto the panels when the time came. Every step of the preparation felt like reclaiming my power inch by inch, and the anticipation of finally turning the tables on Karen was the sweetest kind of fuel. But I wasn't just relying on physical boundaries this time. I wanted witnesses, proof, and a little bit of theater. I discreetly told a couple of neighbors what I was planning. The ones who had quietly supported me from the beginning, and their eyes lit up like kids on Christmas morning. They were tired of Karen, too. Tired of her fake rules, her constant drama, her ability to twist every situation to make herself the victim. If I pulled this off, they promised to have their phones ready to capture every second of Karen's meltdown, ensuring the entire neighborhood would finally see the unfiltered truth about the self-proclaimed queen of community wellness. Finally, the perfect day arrived. Karen parked her car carelessly right across the edge of my driveway, halfway on my property, then strutted off with her yoga mat under her arm, chattering loudly about her next peaceful protest session, to anyone within earshot. I waited until she was well out of sight, then called my handyman, who arrived within minutes with his truck full of materials. The two of us worked fast, every clink of metal and thunk of wood a drumbeat of sweet revenge. We set the fence panels in a tight square around her car, anchored them firmly, locked them with chains and padlocks, and slapped the private property of violators will be prosecuted signs on every side. From the sidewalk, it looked less like a prank and more like an official quarantine zone, a bold and unmissable statement that her intrusion had consequences. By the time we were done, Karen's beloved SUV was penned in like a naughty farm animal, and there was absolutely no way she could drive it out without dismantling the entire setup or admitting to the world that she had been trespassing again. Then came the waiting, and it was glorious. A few curious neighbors wandered over, stifling their laughter as they admired the handiwork. Phones out and ready to record. Some offered me fist bumps. One even brought a lawn chair to watch the show that was about to unfold. We didn't have to wait long. Less than an hour later, Karen came marching down the street, smug as ever, only to stop dead in her tracks when she saw the fence. The transformation on her face was art. Disbelief, outrage, confusion, and finally a shade of red so intense I thought she might actually explode. She sprinted toward the car, rattled the fence panels, screamed my name like a banshee, demanding I take it down immediately. I stepped out onto my porch, calm as a summer breeze, coffee mug in hand, and told her loud enough for every neighbor to hear that I was simply protecting my private property from unauthorized vehicles. You keep saying this is shared space, Karen, I added sweetly. So, I assumed you wouldn't mind sharing a little longer. The crowd of neighbors snickered while Karen sputtered, trying to think of a comeback, but every word that came out only made her look more ridiculous. She threatened to call the police, and I encouraged her to do just that, promising I'd happily show them the footage of her parking illegally on my land every other day. She threatened to sue me, and I told her she'd first need to admit on record that her car had been on my property without permission. Every angle she tried to play was another trap. She walked straight into her own entitlement, tying the ropes tighter around her ego until she was practically shrieking incoherently. The best part was the neighbors filming every second of it. The woman who'd been bullied by Karen about her lawn chairs whispering gleefully, "This is the best day of my life." Eventually, Karen stormed off to fetch bolt cutters, but by then the police had arrived, summoned by someone who had clearly reported a property dispute. This time, the officers didn't even need to hear my side before telling Karen to back off. They explained in excruciating detail that not only had she been trespassing repeatedly, but I had every legal right to fence my property as I saw fit, and if she cut a single chain or touched a single panel, she'd be arrested for destruction of private property. Her attempt to turn the law against me had finally backfired publicly, spectacularly, and there wasn't a single thing she could do about it. The night after fencing Karen's car inside my property felt like a victory lap. But it was the kind of triumph that buzzed with tension. The kind that promised there would be aftershocks because someone like Karen never backed down gracefully. The neighborhood was still buzzing from the spectacle. Clips of her meltdown making the rounds in private group chats. Whispered laughter spreading from one house to the next. But I knew in my gut she wasn't just licking her wounds. She was plotting. And her next move would be louder, crazier, and far less predictable. I sat on my porch that evening under the warm glow of my porch light, the locked fence still standing tall around her SUV like a monument to poetic justice, and I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the adrenaline of the day finally drain out of me while my brain worked overtime to guess what Karen might try next. Part of me hoped the public humiliation had broken her spirit, that maybe she'd slink away and never so much as glance at my porch again. But knowing her inflated ego, that hope was a fantasy. Karen had been dethroned in front of her audience. And if there was one thing I understood about tyrants, it was that they always tried to claw their way back, no matter how ridiculous they looked doing it. The next morning, I didn't have to wonder long. A loud, furious pounding on my door jolted me awake before sunrise. And when I opened it, there stood Karen, hair wild, eyes blazing, still wearing yesterday's yoga pants like she'd spent the whole night pacing and plotting. She didn't even wait for me to say a word before she started screaming that I had kidnapped her vehicle, that my illegal barricade was an act of aggression, and that she would have the entire HOA board descend on me like a swarm of hornets if I didn't unlock the fence immediately. I let her rant, barely holding back my laughter, then calmly reminded her she had parked on my property without permission, that every inch of the fence was legal, and that if she wanted her car back, all she had to do was apologize, admit her trespassing in front of the same neighbors she'd lied to, and promise never to set foot on my porch again. Her jaw dropped as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. And for a long second, she just stared at me like she couldn't process the fact that someone had finally given her terms instead of backing down. Then she shrieked that I was blackmailing her, that this was psychological warfare before storming off in a fresh fit of rage, shouting over her shoulder that this wasn't the end. I knew then that this day wasn't going to be peaceful. Not with Karen's pride wounded and the entire neighborhood watching for her next stunt. Around mid-morning, the chaos truly kicked off when Karen returned with reinforcements. 2 of her most loyal followers and a man in an ill-fitting suit who introduced himself as her legal representative, though he looked more like a distant cousin she'd bribed with free yoga classes. They marched up to my fence like a triumphant army, holding printouts of fabricated HOA bylaws, shouting about community codes and illegal property alterations. I stood there listening, hands in my pockets, while half the neighborhood gathered on sidewalks pretending to water plants or walk dogs. Everyone desperate not to miss a second of the drama. When they demanded I dismantle the fence immediately, I simply pulled out my phone, played the video of Karen parking on my property and trespassing multiple times, and then replayed yesterday's footage of her screaming like a banshee in front of the cop. The so-called lawyer's face paled, and Karen's friends shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were backing a losing battle. But Karen, unable to admit defeat, doubled down, insisting I had set a trap for her car, that I was endangering the community, and that she would escalate this to the highest authorities. I told her she was free to call anyone she liked, including the police, who would no doubt love another chance to tell her to stop trespassing. The crowd snickered. Someone muttered, "Round two." And Karen's fury boiled over until she screamed that she was calling a tow truck to take back her property. That tow truck was her biggest mistake yet. An hour later, a massive vehicle rumbled down the street, its driver stepping out with confusion already written across his face as Karen dramatically pointed at my fenced-in yard, yelling that he needed to remove her car immediately. The man glanced at me at the fence plastered with private property signs, then at Karen's wild expression, and shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I can't tow a vehicle from private property without the owner's permission," he said firmly. "You parked there illegally. Looks like they've locked it up legally. This is between you two." Karen erupted, waving her arms, demanding he do his job. But the driver just climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Karen screaming in the street like a cartoon villain whose evil plan had backfired. The crowd of neighbors watching openly now erupted in muffled laughter, a few even clapping sarcastically as Karen stomped her feet, red-faced and sputtering. Each failed attempt to regain control chipped away at the untouchable reputation she'd built for years. And I could see it in the way people's eyes shifted, the way they whispered behind their hands. For once, they weren't afraid of Karen. They were laughing at her. By late afternoon, Karen had gone from furious to desperate. She tried bargaining with me, offering vague promises of peaceful coexistence if I would just unlock the fence. I told her I'd consider it if she apologized publicly to every neighbor she'd harassed over the years, admitted her lies about my porch being community space, and stopped using the HOA like a personal weapon. Predictably, she refused, muttering that I was insane and vindictive. But I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes because she realized I wasn't bluffing. And this time, no amount of yelling would save her. The fence stood firm, her car trapped like a monument to her entitlement, and every hour that passed chipped away at her carefully built image of control. By evening she slunk away, muttering threats that sounded less convincing with each step, and I sat on my porch, watching the sun set over the locked fence, feeling a strange combination of satisfaction and exhaustion. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly, but the power dynamic had shifted completely. She wasn't the neighborhood tyrant anymore. She was the spectacle everyone mocked, the self-proclaimed queen stripped of her throne, and I had become the one neighbor finally willing to stand up to her and win. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the quiet hum of crickets outside, I thought about how far this had gone. A week ago, I couldn't have imagined being in a war with someone over my own porch. Couldn't have pictured setting up a fence just to keep a grown woman from treating my property like a yoga studio. But Karen had dragged me into her world of absurd entitlement, forced me to fight fire with fire. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Karen's SUV was still locked inside the fence on my property, standing there like a silent victory flag waving in the wind. And I could tell the humiliation was eating her alive because she wasn't stomping around in public anymore. Not yet, at least. The neighborhood had seen too much already. Every failed attempt to take control blowing up in her face. And for the first time in years, Karen's reign of terror had cracks running all through it. But I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't just surrender. They bided their time, came back meaner, louder, and willing to throw anyone under the bus to regain the power they thought belonged to them. I stayed on high alert that day, sipping coffee on my porch, security cameras recording everything. Neighbors walking by giving me nods of approval and whispered thanks for doing what none of them had dared to try. It felt good to finally have the upper hand, but I could sense the storm gathering in the distance, and by late afternoon, it arrived in the form of Karen stomping down the street with a clipboard in one hand and a portable speaker in the other, followed by a ragtag group of her most loyal followers. She had set up what she called a community meeting right in the middle of the street, blasting her voice through the speaker as she shouted about tyranny, illegal imprisonment of personal property, and neighbors who spread hatred instead of harmony. It would have been comical if she wasn't so loud. Her face flushed, eyes wild, spewing lies about me to anyone with an earshot, painting herself as the victim of a cruel neighbor who locked her vehicle for sport and assaulted innocent wellness practitioners with water attacks. The sheer desperation dripping from her words made my blood boil and my lips curl in disbelief all at once. Because Karen wasn't just trying to save face anymore. She was rewriting history in real time, throwing every ounce of energy into making me the villain while she posed as some kind of martyr for the cause of community love and free yoga. I stood on my porch, let her rant, let her lies hang in the air long enough for everyone to taste the absurdity of them. And then I finally decided it was time to end this once and for all. I had stayed quiet long enough, endured enough ridiculous accusations, and now I had the receipts to burn every false word she'd ever spewed. I grabbed my phone, walked calmly to the crowd that had formed, neighbors leaning on fences, and standing on sidewalks. Everyone curious to see the latest round of Karen's theatric. I held up the phone, opened the folder of videos I had been collecting for days, and started playing them one by one on full volume. There was Karen parking on my property without permission, smiling smugly as she strutted away. There was Karen trespassing on my porch with her yoga class, ignoring my repeated requests to leave. There was the police officer telling her in no uncertain terms that it was my private property and she had no rights there. And then there was yesterday's footage of her screaming like a banshee, threatening to sue me, call the cops, anything to get her way, all while the fence stood there legally protecting my space. The crowd watched in stunned silence, eyes darting from the videos to Karen's increasingly pale face as every lie she'd told came crashing down in front of her audience. I could almost see the power draining from her. Every bit of fake authority she'd clung to evaporating under the weight of undeniable truth. But the real blow came next because I wasn't just out to clear my name anymore. I wanted Karen to finally face consequences for years of bullying the entire neighborhood. I had spent the past few days quietly gathering stories from other residents. Their whispered confessions of how Karen had harassed them, spread rumors, tried to control what they planted in their yards, even filed fake complaints just to get fines issued against people she didn't like. With their permission, I laid it all out in front of everyone, reading off incident after incident. Each one backed by a message, a recording, a photo. The crowd that had once been too afraid to stand against her was now murmuring angrily, turning their glares from me to her, realizing they hadn't been victims of community spirit enforcement, but of Karen's personal crusade to rule the block. She tried to shout me down, tried to scream over the evidence, but it was useless now because every time she opened her mouth, someone else stepped forward, adding their story, piling on until the picture of who Karen truly was couldn't be ignored. The self-proclaimed queen of neighborhood harmony had been exposed as nothing more than a petty tyrant, a chronic liar whose power only lasted as long as people stayed quiet. When the HOA president himself finally appeared, clearly having been dragged out by the commotion, Karen made one last desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative, waving her clipboard and screeching about illegal actions and neighbors out of control. But the president didn't buy a word of it. He had seen the videos, heard the other residents, and instead of siding with her, he told her flatly that not only was my fence perfectly legal, but that her repeated trespassing, harassment, and false reports violated multiple HOA bylaws. The look on Karen's face was priceless, a mixture of disbelief and raw panic, as the very system she had weaponized against others turned on her. The president went on to warn her that any further harassment would result in fines, possible legal action, and even removal from the HOA board she'd once used like her personal army. For the first time since this absurd battle began, Karen had no comeback, no fake law to wave in my face, no empty threat to throw. She just stood there trembling, the clipboard clutched to her chest, the crowd staring, the whispers growing louder as the neighborhood finally saw her for what she was. By the time the meeting dispersed, Karen had slunk back to her house. The same woman who once strutted down the street, barking orders, now moving like a ghost, stripped of its haunt. Her car was still locked in behind the fence. My victory still standing for all to see. But now it wasn't just about me and her anymore. The balance of the entire neighborhood had shifted. People finally realizing they didn't have to live under Karen's thumb. That standing up to her wasn't just possible, but necessary. Neighbors I barely knew came to shake my hand, thank me for what I'd done. Some laughing about how they'd been waiting years for someone to finally knock Karen off her self-built pedestal. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before. A collective exhale from people who had been holding their breath for too long, waiting for change. That night, as I sat on my porch under the stars, the locked fence still glinting in the moonlight, I felt a deep, hard-earned sense of peace settle over me for the first time since this insanity began. It wasn't over completely. Not yet. Karen was the kind of person who would lick her wounds, plan her comeback, and try one last time to claw back the scraps of power she had left. But now she wasn't just facing me. She was facing a whole neighborhood that had seen the truth. A wall of people unwilling to let her reign of terror continue. She had brought this war to my doorstep, thinking I'd cave like everyone else had before me. But instead I'd built a fortress of facts, boundaries, and pure stubborn willpower that she couldn't tear down. The next morning dawned brighter than any day before, but I knew the storm had one last breath left in it before the skies cleared completely. Karen's car still sat locked behind the fence, her defeated silence across the street, almost louder than her usual screaming fits, and the entire neighborhood seemed to hang in a strange state of anticipation, waiting to see whether she would lash out one final time or finally surrender to reality. I poured myself a coffee and sat on my porch, feeling a calm defiance settle in my bones. I wasn't just protecting my property anymore. This had become about every person she had ever bullied, every lie she had ever told to get her way, every time she had turned the rules upside down to make herself queen of the block. Today, I had a feeling would be the last chapter of her reign, and if she was planning one last desperate stunt, I was more than ready to flip the script for good. Around mid-morning, I saw movement from Karen's house. She emerged in full performance mode, dressed not in her usual pastel yoga attire, but in a dramatic all-black outfit as though she were heading to a courtroom showdown. Following her were two men carrying video equipment and a third person holding a microphone, clearly some cheap attempt to stage a news report or viral video painting her as a victim of neighborly tyranny. She strutted down the street, fake tears already glistening in her eyes, announcing loudly that she was about to expose injustice to the world and hold criminals accountable. The audacity almost made me laugh out loud because after everything that had happened after being caught on camera trespassing, lying, and harassing everyone in the neighborhood, she had the gall to bring a camera crew to try and rewrite the story one last time. Neighbors came out to watch, phones ready, whispering eagerly because they knew what was coming. And for once, they weren't scared of Karen anymore. They were expecting her grand finale to backfire just like everything else she tried. And I had no intention of letting them down. She approached my fence dramatically, gesturing wildly to the cameras, calling my property a prison, claiming I had violated her basic human rights by not allowing her to reclaim her car. Her voice quivered theatrically as she said she feared for her safety living next to such hostility. Every word a desperate attempt to paint herself as a victim while ignoring the mountain of evidence that had already exposed her true behavior. I let her rant for a full 2 minutes, the crowd growing restless, some neighbors chuckling under their breath. Before I stood and walked calmly toward her, holding my phone like a sword, ready to slice through every lie she dared to utter without saying a word, I played the now famous video of her trespassing, ignoring my repeated demands to leave, then the footage of her screaming at the police, then the one where she tried to sell my house to strangers. I turned the volume all the way up, letting her own voice echo through the street as the fake tears on her cheeks froze and her carefully crafted performance crumbled under the weight of truth. The camera crew hesitated, confused, unsure whether they were filming a victim's story or a live self-destruction. The crowd laughed openly now, someone even shouting, "Tell the news about the yoga classes on someone else's porch, Karen." Her face flushed deep red. Her hands flailed as she screamed at the men with the cameras to cut the feed. But it was too late. Every phone in the crowd was recording. Every neighbor now united in their mockery of her desperate charade. Finally, with her last attempt to manipulate public opinion shattered, Karen turned on me, pointing a trembling finger and shouting incoherent threats about lawsuits and vengeance. But there was no power in her words anymore. The HOA president stepped forward, backed by several other board members who had come to witness the scene themselves, and in front of everyone, they announced that Karen had officially been stripped of her position on the HOA board. They cited repeated harassment, abuse of power, false complaints, and defamation against multiple residents, making it clear that her so-called authority in the neighborhood was finished for good. The cheer that erupted from the crowd was unlike anything I had heard since moving here. A wave of relief and long-suppressed joy washing over everyone who had endured years of her tyranny. Karen looked around wildly, realizing she had no allies left, no one to back her, no one to fear her anymore. She tried to speak, tried to shout over the crowd, but every word was drowned out by the sound of neighbors clapping, laughing, and celebrating their freedom from her rule. With her title gone, her lies exposed, and her audience turned against her, Karen finally had no choice but to accept the one offer I had made from the beginning. Trembling with rage, tears of frustration streaking her face, she muttered a half-hearted apology, barely audible over the cheering, admitting that she had parked on my property and trespassed repeatedly, promising in a cracked voice never to set foot on my porch again. I walked over slowly, unlocked the padlocks on the fence, and swung the panels open like a prison gate, letting her beloved SUV free at last. But the victory wasn't hers. The neighborhood knew it. I knew it. And she knew it, too. She climbed into the car, humiliated, avoiding every pair of eyes fixed on her, and sped off down the street without another word, leaving behind the rubble of her broken reputation. The moment she disappeared, a cheer went up that shook the air, neighbors clapping me on the back, thanking me for doing what they had wished they could for years. Laughter rang out as people replayed the footage, joking about Karen's failed stunts, marveling at how her iron grip on the block had vanished in a single week. The HOA president promised new rules to protect homeowners from harassment, a motion that passed unanimously on the spot. And for the first time since I had moved into this neighborhood, it actually felt like a community. Not a kingdom ruled by one woman's ego, but a place where people looked out for each other, where respect mattered more than manipulation. That evening, as the sun set and the street finally fell quiet, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee and looked around at my reclaimed sanctuary. There were no yoga mats, no chalk arrows, no flyers littering my mailbox. Just peace, hard-earned and sweeter than I'd imagined possible a week ago. My phone buzzed endlessly with neighbors sending thank you messages, some saying they felt free for the first time in years. I thought about the absurdity of it all. How one woman's unchecked entitlement had turned into a war that had spiraled out of control, but also how standing firm, refusing to be bullied, had shifted everything for everyone. Karen might still try to stir trouble in the future, but her power was gone, her voice nothing more than background noise in a neighborhood that finally saw her for what she truly was. As darkness settled in, and a cool breeze swept over the porch I had fought so hard to protect, I leaned back in my chair, a deep, satisfied breath leaving my chest. This war had started with a stolen space and a woman who thought she could take whatever she wanted without consequence. But it ended with justice, truth, and a community no longer afraid of.